Hi, everybody. Welcome to this week's Textile Talk. This week, it's being sponsored by Studio Art Quilt Associates, or SAQA. And we're going to have the honor of meeting with 4 of the artists from Opposites Attract, which is one of SAQA's traveling global exhibitions. It was supposed to be being displayed at several different venues down in Australia and New Zealand, but those have been postponed because of the pandemic. So we wanted to share some of it with you today so that you can learn more about this exhibition. The Textile Talks are a series of presentations that are being co-sponsored by 6 different fiber art organizations: SAQA, Surface Design Association, the Quilt Alliance, the San Jose Museum of Quilts and Textiles, the International Quilt Museum, and the Modern Quilt Guild. This week it's our turn, and we're very excited to be able to share today's presentation with you. Before we start the presentation, though, I wanted to make sure that you're aware of the SAQA annual benefit auction, which is going to be starting next week on Friday. We have 496 beautiful, gorgeous works of art that will be up for auction starting on next Friday, a week from Friday, on the 11th. And these have been donated by our members. All the proceeds from the auction go to support SAQA's exhibitions program and its educational programming, such as the Textile Talks. The way that the auction works is that on Friday, all the pieces are available for $1,000. Starting the following Monday, the price for the first section, section 1, will drop to $750, then to $550, till by the following Saturday, the pieces in section 1 will be just $100. Each year, SAQA raises about $65,000 from people generously purchasing these gorgeous works of art. You can find more information about the auction, I hope you'll be part of it, by going to www.saqa.com/auction. All right. Now, today we're going to get to meet 4 of the artists from Opposites Attract. And before we get started, I want to thank our sponsors who make the Textile Talks possible: Artistic Artifacts, Oriful Threads, C&T Publishing, eQuilter.com, Handy Quilter, Misty Fuse, Moda Fabrics, 9 Patch Fabrics, Schiffer Publishing, and thequiltshow.com. Without the support of these sponsors, the Textile Talks would not be possible. So we really appreciate their support. All right. We're going to now take you behind the scenes so that you can meet 4 of the artists from Opposites Attract, find out a little bit about their art practice, their studio practice, and the work that they made that got juried into Opposites Attract. So I'd like first to introduce you to Claire Passmore.
Hi, everybody. This is Claire. I'm a textile artist and teacher from the UK, and I'm very proud, of course, to be part of this SAQA exhibition. Next, please. The piece I have hanging in this exhibition is called Round Hole plus Square Peg equals Space to Grow, and it measures 46 by 31 inches, mostly overall. And it kind of sums up how I feel about not confining yourself, but by finding the space you need to explore possibilities and find out things that you might not have expected. I'm so happy that this piece has been able to travel because, over to the other side of the world, especially now we can't. So I think it's another one of the great opportunities that being a SAQA member offers. For years now, I've been working with a variety of different fabrics instead of my normal go-to cotton poplin and quilt wadding. And using these different fabrics has given me a really fresh outlook. And as a result, my studio practice has become much more open-ended. Next, please. These are a few close-ups which zoom in on the construction of the piece. It's actually made from lots of these little square packet shapes, which are all joined together by a tiny little glass bead in the corners. It makes them all hinge, and the whole thing is very flexible. It was a nightmare to try and keep it all together and sort of manage it, especially organizing the hanging. All of the little packets are made from really vibrantly dyed pieces of organdy fabric, cotton organdy, which I pleated and folded and hand stitched. And it's a fabric that I've absolutely fallen in love with. Each one of those little packets then had a large hole cut into it, and then another smaller square folded and loosely floated inside and joined with just a few threads. And those are the square pegs, and then into those I cut another little round hole. So those are the square pegs in the round holes. And that wiggle room all the way around the outside of each of them is the breathing space that I talked about earlier, the space for creativity and thought and exploration. And each one of them is different because I was just having such a great time, just trying out different things and making more and more and more of them, that I just made an enormous pile, and I just kept on getting new ideas. Next, please. And here I am stitching the squares. The one downside of this crunchy organdy fabric is that when you have lots of layers of it, it's really difficult to stitch. And I've never ever mastered the use of a thimble. I probably should try a bit harder, but I just can't get the hang of it. And so when my fingers just get too sore, I just switch to the machine and do a little bit of machine stitch instead, just to give my fingers a rest. And on the right, there are a few of the leftover square packets that I made. I just made heaps of them, like I said, and just puzzled them all together on the design wall until I got an arrangement that I was happy with. Next, please. And this colorful mess is a pile of the offcuts from all of the little trimmings that I had left over. And I must say, I find them so pretty that I can't bear to throw them away. So I have a huge bucket full of them. And from time to time, I just grab a few out and fold them up and add little bits and pieces to things. Next, please. Another thing I love about organdy fabric is that it really, really takes color, dye or paint really easily and quickly, and you get such an intense color from it. I think they almost look like jewels to me. It's also really easy to stencil and print onto, which are all things that I love to do. It helps me indulge my messy side. Next, please. And here I am figuring out some possibilities when I'm folding the fabric. This cotton organdy takes a crease just like paper, and it's great for making 3D shapes. My current favorite, as you can see here, is a triangle-based pyramid or tetrahedron. And once you get the hang of it, they're really easy to fold, and you can very quickly dye some fabric and make hundreds of these tetrahedra, and then start puzzling them together to make some really interesting structures. Next, please. This piece is called Storm and was part of the SAQA No Limits virtual exhibition. The virtual exhibitions are also another great SAQA opportunity because not only do they allow pieces like this, which are difficult to ship, or if you live far away from the US, then or if they need to travel, then they're difficult to travel, then it's a great opportunity because you can enter these more unusual pieces, and they can easily get put into the virtual galleries. And I guess as well, you know, in these strange times, it means that at least these galleries can go on, whereas lots of the other galleries couldn't. This piece is made from 64 blue tetrahedra joined in a lattice structure, which measures around 40 by 46 inches. And as I was stitching them all together, I got the feeling that I was sort of handling a huge storm cloud. So I added silver leaf to represent lightning strikes throughout the piece. And you can actually get a better view of this from the side view. So next, please. And you can see here that those are the tetrahedra that stand off of the wall. And if you look carefully, there's lots of hand stitch, tiny seed stitch all over it as well. And the really nice thing about this cotton organdy is that if you get the geometry right, then it can hold its own weight without any need for any other stiffening or armature. So it's quite versatile once you sort of start playing around with it. Next, please. But for me, the really fascinating thing happens when these shapes get stacked, and they can stack, and then when they fold onto each other, some really cool shapes start to form. This is from my connectivity series, and these 3 pieces are actually just one piece. But the nice thing is that every time you pick it up and then put it down, each of the pieces folds and flops around, and it magically somehow folds into a different shape. And so you've got all these different arrangements just from one piece. Next, please. And this is still the same piece. It's formed from 18 of those tetrahedra, stitched into stacks of 3 and then joined together. And in some ways, I just love these little pockets that seem to form as it folds around. Next, please. And this is another one. This one, it has a similar structure, except it's only made from 15 tetrahedra. So you can see it's got some similarities, but the way that they're joined means that it falls into slightly different shapes. And this one makes me kind of think of a sinister flower. Next, please. And here's another. This one is interesting in that when it's suspended, I really like the way that when it twirls around, you can see deep inside into the center, and there's lots of extra stitching in there that you can't really see at the moment, but as you get closer and as it turns, you can see deep inside it. And this one's got lots and lots of stitch all over it. Next, please. And finally, this is my contribution to this year's SAQA benefit auction. And I know that you've already heard about this, but I think it's a great opportunity for us to all to be able to maybe buy a small piece of art donated by SAQA members that we might otherwise never ever be able to own. This one is called Oba-san, and the lady I've depicted there she was my very, very sweet Japanese neighbor called Mrs. Ogura. Last year I made her husband Mr. Ogura, and it's an ink painted lino print, and I printed it onto spunbound fabric, so it's got a really interesting texture, and decorated it with sashiko stitching to honor Mrs. Ogura, and ink all over the background. So hopefully it'll find a new home. So thanks for listening, and now it's over to you, Maria.
Good morning, afternoon, and evening. My name is Maria Schell, and I live in Anchorage, Alaska, and it's morning here. I'm really excited and grateful to be part of this presentation and this global SAQA exhibition, Opposites Attract. So if we want to take a look at our first slide, which is an image of my quilt called Trance, and it is basically opposites as in black and white, and what the potential for vibration and optical excitement really just that come out of those opposites. Trance is part of a larger series that I call color grids. If we want to look at the next slide. And these are all 4 maquettes, which are small sort of sketches based on, there's a couple different ways that you can look at it. I think of it, the quilt block, you can call it a cross square. There's some other names for it. That's the one I tend to call it. You can also call it an uneven 7 patch, sorry. So you've got the 4 patches in the corners that are all usually the same information, and then the grid that they're built into, which in this case, a couple of these have different information going horizontally from what's happening vertically. So I've done a lot of these smaller pieces, and sometimes I blow them up to larger pieces, or sometimes I combine them into a larger piece, which is what this next quilt is. This is called Dance Party, and it is 9 individual color grids with, they all have their own compositions, but the grids and the squares, which are often called housetop blocks, are the same size almost, and so they form this grid. Occasionally, I should say actually more often than occasionally, I'll find a quilt block that I really like, and then I'll multiply it out. So if we look at the middle left block, and I decided to multiply it out, and we can see that quilt in the next slide. And it is called Citizens United, and to me, it's fascinating how when you multiply it out, it's the same information, but the multiplication of it creates this intensity that doesn't necessarily exist when it's just one block. There was a point where I really wanted to make a bunch of these and display them in a large grid, and I had an opportunity to do that, and we can look at that in the next slide. This is 9 of my color grid quilts displayed at the Bellevue Art Museum in Bellevue, Washington, as part of, they have a biennale, obviously every other year. This particular year, it was fiber. They focus on a different craft every other year. And it was super fun to see all of them displayed together. One thing I realized is that you can tell they're not all the same size. When I was working on them, it just didn't register to me because I was working from photos and they all look the same size in the photo. And then the point where I realized they weren't the same size, I was too far down in the exhibition process to change things. Let's take a look at the next slide. So this quilt's called Boulevard, and it is an elongation of the quilt block that I've been working with. And the grid is the same, but each housetop block has different information in it. And another thing I like to do is that if I really like the information in a housetop block, I will also multiply it out. And we can take a look at that in this next slide. There's 2 different quilts that are, oh, I don't know, Lucy, can we go back 1 second? So if you look at the lower left-hand corner, you'll see that quilt block, which I really liked, and I wanted to multiply out. So then go forward again. And here I multiplied it out once, and then I multiplied it out 4 times to get the larger quilt. So the one on the left is called Way to Graces, and the larger quilt with the multiplication of the blocks is called Tribe. Next slide, please. So this quilt has, it's similar to that dance party quilt we looked at the beginning in that it's 9 individual blocks where the gridding is the same size and the housetop blocks are the same size. I don't know if all of you recognize the very center block is actually the trance quilt where it's just 1 block, but in trance I've multiplied it out. So each one of these quilts has a 12-inch version, an 18-inch version, I'm multiplying out, which is what trance is, and then this final quilt, which is called Wall of Sound. And I did that as part of an exhibition that was in Ohio. Look at the next quilt. Next slide, please. This is me taking that quilt block and making it as small as I possibly can. This quilt is almost entirely composed of little teeny cross squares that are made out of vintage scrap fabrics that I primarily purchased on eBay. I have a system for making them in groups of about 7 at a time. And this quilt was part of Quilt National 2015. We'll look at the next slide. Now this quilt is actually, it's all house tops without the grid in between all of them. And it's called Mosh Pit at the Golden. And I've been teaching a lot. And as I started teaching, I really wanted to incorporate some of the things that I explore in my classes. So this has a lot more patterning. It's a lot more, I mean, I know people think my work is chaotic, but this is sort of pushing that edge of chaos. And the next quilt is on the opposite end of the spectrum. This is a quilt, this is the most recent quilt that I finished. I haven't quilted it yet, but it's called Solace, and it's actually the quilt that is behind me. And it is that same format of a color grid, but a really toned down color palette for me. And finally, take a look at my auction quilt, which is called Vote. And if we look at that, back at the quilt that was called Wall of Sound, where trance was in the very center, there was a quilt, this quilt block is in that larger quilt also. I thought it was a really good auction quilt for this year because I really hope everyone will get out and vote. And thank you all for joining us. I think Maggie Vanderweit is next.
Hi, I don't know if you can see or hear me. It's not coming up. I'll just start. All right.
We can hear you, Maggie. Go.
Okay. All right. Thanks so much to SAQA for this wonderful opportunity to share my work, and to those of you who have joined us. And I hope you're all doing really, really well. So why petroglyphs? Petroglyphs are on my quilt. You'll see them in a minute. I've had a lifelong interest in First Nations or Indigenous cultures. My ex-husband is Cree from Northern Quebec, and an early trip with our sons was to a National Historic Site in Canada. I live near Toronto, Canada, called Petroglyph National Park, and it's in Peterborough, Ontario. And I was really, really moved by the stories that were told by the over 900 images that were carved into the limestone. Petroglyphs, they're found around the world, and they're often very hard to date, and they range in age from many thousands to hundreds of years old. And I feel that this ancient art, these rocks that teach, are portals to past artists and their lives. And they also offer a really profound connection to the spirit world. For me, and I imagine for the people that lived long ago and created these images. So my husband Fred and I now make these fabulous World Heritage sites our destinations very often when we travel. And here I am in Aztec Ruins National Monument near Farmington, New Mexico. And the enchanting tiny doorways went on forever behind me. Next, please. This is my piece for Opposites Attract, and it's called Written in Stone. It's 52 by 43, and it's based on some of the images at the aptly named Newspaper Rock in San Juan County in Utah. It has a huge collection of symbols, animals, fanciful human figures, and records of past events. There's just a few of them on this quilt. Written in Stone is a commentary on how we communicate then and now. That's the opposites that I was examining, the past and the present. How we do this using whatever materials we have at hand: rock, paper, cloth, blood, ink, clay, and now thread and paint and markers. Throughout human history, we've used such different methods, but we all have this universal longing to share our stories and make them come alive and maybe even endure. The corner blocks say love, 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 and the figures are all moving up towards the promise of a good future, we hope. Next, please. This is a detail, and it shows the construction technique of machine stitching 7-ounce canvas with some raw edges and some bound edges. And then I add hand embroidery, paint, and the figures were drawn in this piece with permanent marker. Because it was called Written in Stone, I wanted to do writing as well. So look around, see if you can see it, turtles and their eggs, deer, buffalo, lots of celestial symbols, and even people on horseback. Notice the emphasis on the oversized tracks and the hand and footprints that announce we were here. And you'll see that in petroglyphs around the world, hand and footprints. Next, please. The borders were done in commercial text fabrics, which annotate everything from the mundane to the sublime, like letters, lists, lexicons, and articles, the way that we do today. So many of us are makers and writers, and you can see food remains a constant source of interest. Next, please. This is at Newspaper Rock, and you can see that the sandstone has a dark rusty colored surface, which is called a desert varnish. It was carved into, revealing the lighter layers below. And I think it's really wonderful that these fragile images have remained, although you can see some of them are wearing off at the top. Next, please. This piece is behind me, and it's called Betalina Threads. It's 56 by 34. It takes its inspiration from a magical UNESCO petroglyph complex in northern Italy, which we first learned about on a TV show chronicling the world's oldest maps. So it's carved into a flat gray Permian sandstone rock, which is about 27 feet by 12 feet, and it's situated on a hilltop. It shows early agriculturally based village life. So I don't know if you can see fields, the lookout towers, walls, streams, and these really fantastical animals. It's said to be the first map evidencing the radical shift from nomadic hunting and gathering to a settled farming existence, which of course changed human history completely, because that meant that there was now territory to encircle and protect. Next, please. Here's a detail. This is my favorite part of this quilt, were the tall houses and the really wonky people and wonky critters. But I was amazed that the houses looked like they had windows and doors and multiple stories. The figures on the art quilt were all drawn in free motion on my regular size domestic machine, and I used black threads to do that. Next, please. When we visited Betalina, there I am there, we were alone for hours, and I was in my glory. I just still remember being radiantly happy there. You can see the Swiss Italian Alps behind us in the background, and the houses that were in the last shot are down by my feet. It's probably hard to see, but they were down to the left of my feet. The marks here don't show two colors. They're kind of worn and faded, so they're hard to read, but you know, I took a lot of pictures. Next, please. I've been inspired to make many petroglyph stamps from different materials, and I use them often in my work. They're variations on ancient petroglyphs with lots of my own designs added. I love my whimsical bird-headed figures most of all. Dancing with the Man on the Moon was made for Suzanne Miller-Jones' exhibition called Fly Me to the Moon a few years ago. I imagine ancient people reaching out to the heavens in despair and in celebration. The background is eco-dyed cotton. The figures are printed and painted with acrylics, and the thin black line represents the divide between here and there, now and then, the prayer and the response. Next, please. This is Genesis, and it went to an exhibition called Shapeshifters in Oregon. The ultimate transformation is, of course, procreation. I wonder if ancient people understood how we are born, or just how those eggs, our children, appeared. I remain constantly engaged by my own imaginings of the tales that these petroglyphs might tell. Next, please. Here's another quote using the same female figure. I think of it as a female figure by the sway of her hips and the sort of swagger that she's got going on. This one's called To the Other Place. It's 22 by 33, and it highlights the portal into potential, the moment that the curtain parts the veil of time and space and we walk through. Maybe we walk into the afterlife. Maybe we simply go to the places where we dream or meditate. Next, please. This is Parowan Gap in Utah, and it's a high, narrow, windy pass carved out by an ancient river, and it's filled with images. The carvings there have been done over time by different groups, just like modern day graffiti artists layering over other people's work. The petroglyph behind me tells the story of a great leader who led his people through many hardships to arrive at this place. And you can sort of see this, the sort of triangular shape of the circle at the bottom, and that was to represent that he died there, so his head is down. But he got them this far, and so he was greatly honored. Next, please. It's hard to express the joy and connection I feel in these sacred places. I speculate that I was a petroglyph artist for many past lives, and finding glimpses of the work that remains delights me. I'm so grateful for the adventures and travels that have brought me back to my petroglyph beginnings. Next, please. Highlighting another one of my themes, the meaning of chairs, is my spotlight auction piece for this year. It's called Watching Over Us All. The solid antique chair represents us being grounded and sitting still in a safe place, now during COVID and at any time really. The wings come from the guardians who love and protect all of us. They were made using a digitally altered photo transfer of ptarmigan wings, which my son Jordan saved for me from a successful winter hunt. He lives up north on the reserve, and he lives quite a traditional life in a lot of ways. So coming full circle, I also wish to honor and share the many blessings of today's First Nations cultures. Thank you so much for your kind attention, and now on to the fabulous Libby Williamson.
Thank you, Maggie, and hello, everyone. I'm Libby Williamson. I'm a fiber artist and a teacher from Connecticut, now living in Southern California. I am really, really happy to be here and very honored to be part of this presentation. So we'll go to my first slide, which is my piece that's in this exhibit. It's called A Common Thread. I've been using tea bags, used tea bags in my work for many years. And I was initially treating each little tea bag as its own separate individual piece of art. But I really like to work large, and I was frustrated by the tiny little size. So my natural progression was to combine all of the little individual pieces into a larger composition. And it was also important in my early work for me to have ingested the tea from every single tea bag. And that meant drinking a lot of tea, drying all the tea bags, emptying them, prepping them for the stitching. And anyway, so my process involves collaging each little tea bag separately with little bits of hand-painted paper and fabric, and then using free motion stitching and handwork on each one. And then taking all of the little elements and combining them into a larger substrate. So we'll go to the next slide and it'll show you some detail of the same piece. The concept of this quilt is about belonging and about acceptance. And it references the social exclusion that can come from different economic classes, ethnic groups, and religions. And it's about how we're strengthened by our diversity. So the plan for this piece was to take groups of separate tea bags and combine them and make them, group them into quadrants. Each individual tea bag is worked separately, and then I used similarities within the group. So I was using common fabrics or common stitching patterns to unify the bags within each group. And just like in our society where we can find common ground, which unites us in our differences. I used a wide variety of fabric. I used everything. I wanted to use a lot of different texture and a lot of different qualities of fabric. So there's everything in here from burlap to silk. And you'll also see a lot of zippers. I use zippers and measuring tapes. They're personal icons of mine that are in many of my works. And in this case, the zippers work metaphorically to join the different components together. So we'll go to the next slide, please. This piece is called Etiquette in Connecticut. I began this one with over 200 used tea bags, which I collaged with strips of different fabrics, and then individually free motion stitched them and readied them for the handwork. And this piece is particularly important to me right now since it references the current situation with my mom. I made this piece over a period of time when I was helping Mom pack up our family home when she was moving to her now current assisted living facility. So I traveled back and forth from California to Connecticut and took all these little tea bags with me on the plane and stitched them while I was in flight. And then also at night when I was with Mom, we would stitch together. She would actually knit and I would stitch the little handwork on these. And then when I had them all hand stitched, I rearranged them for hours and hours and tried out different compositions. And then I settled on this composition, which is very asymmetrical, sorry, lost that word. And there are some symbolic references in the arrangement of some of the pieces, but I will point out one that is important to me. In the bottom right corner of the large piece, you can see 6 tea bags that are arranged to form a house. And this is clearly a nod to my family home and to also the new home for my mom. And next slide, please. This is another important quilt to me called Breaking the Mold. This is the first piece that I made in a series of mine that I'm continuing, where I'm using rope in place of batting as my inner layer. And this piece was made for an invitational exhibit called Power of Women. And the stipulation was that it had to be a finished size of 2 feet by 6 feet. And I knew that while I was inventing this technique, I was going to be faced with a lot of challenges with the engineering and the construction of the piece. And so we'll go to the next slide and I can show you some of the process of that. So I envisioned this going together. I knew that the rope was going to heavily distort the image, and that was my plan. And I also knew that it was only going to shrink in one direction. And so what I ended up having to do, I created an entire prototype, which you can see hanging on the back side of my studio wall. And so through that process, I was able to study and learn about the distortion and the shrinkage rates. And then you can see the proportions on that back prototype are kind of odd and a little bit disjointed. So I learned a lot about the painted figure and how it was going to be affected once it was stitched together. So I took all that information and I altered the shape of the final piece, which you see laying down on my studio floor, which started out as a piece of unbleached muslin that was 2 feet wide by 10 feet tall. And I painted that very elongated figure and then spent hours using a collection of different markers to journal on the figure. And this piece is especially important to me. It is about my daughter and about my mom. And it's about raising this amazing girl, my amazing daughter. So we'll go to the next slide, please. This is the last quilt I have to show you, but I have 3 different slides showing the different stages of this. It's another rope quilt, and this time it's freeform, so it's not on any type of backing. And I approached this differently, where I had just a general idea of what I wanted, and then I let it evolve, and I worked intuitively, building from the center outward. There's a large central area that's framed by the ropes. And in this case, the ropes are also playing a different part in the imagery, where they are referencing a tangle of seaweed. So let's go to the next detail slide. So the photo that's in the center, that is the beginnings of the fish body. And I started painting on very shiny silk. And I added cutout parts of painted silk on it to applique, and then I also painted directly onto the silk where the fins are. And then the photo in the top left-hand corner, that's showing some of the free motion stitching that I added, and then also some rows of the rope being added to frame the fish body. The photo on the left-hand side shows a lot of the hand stitching from the inside. And then there's also that red lump of red felt. What I did was I used many layers of red felt. It didn't have to be red, but that's what I had. And I cut it to the size of the main body of the fish, and then embedded it in between all of the layers of the quilt, so that from the front, the body of the fish popped out and gave it more dimension. And then the bottom left photo references this quilt is completely double-sided, and as I was constructing it, it hangs from one central point, so the balance got kind of skewed, and I didn't want to create a composition that was symmetrical. So in order to correct the balance when it hung, I embedded those metal washers inside some of the layers to help correct the balance when it hung. And we can go to the last slide that shows the back. And so the same piece, and you can see all of the hand stitching, the layers of tulle and satins, and again, some of the rope that this time is couched on top, referencing the seaweed and the kelp. And then one little detail that I threw in here on the right-hand side of the screen, you can see an image. And if you look closely, there's a safety pin that's hanging from a piece of string. So the reference of that, this quilt is about a childhood memory of mine where I used to pretend to fish from a local stone bridge in Connecticut over a brook. And I didn't want to actually catch a fish, and I certainly didn't want to touch a fish. So I dangled a string over the bridge into the water with a closed safety pin at the end. And for bait, I used mini marshmallows, really gross yellow cheese, and chewed up chiclets. And needless to say, I never caught a fish, and that's where they all got away. They swam away. And then my last slide, we'll go to the next, is my auction piece. This is entitled Boundaries. It's a reflection of this current time in quarantine, and it's about my physical boundaries, my personal boundaries, and emotional boundaries that we're all facing today. And that's the end of my presentation. We can go back to Martha now for some question and answers.
Thank you so much. I'd like all of our artists to come back on, and I have a lot of questions for you from our attendees. So, Claire, the question is, were you talking about organdy or organza?
I was talking about cotton organdy.
Okay.
Someone I saw also asked, was it silk organdy? No, it's cotton organdy.
Mm-hmm. And do you think that you could create any type of origami shape with the material?
I reckon you can, yes. It's just like paper. It's stiff and it holds its shape. And sometimes when you're not paying enough attention and you accidentally sit on one and it all gets scrunched. And don't panic, because unlike paper, all you have to do, you could got two options. You can either just open it out, iron it again, and magically it just kind of gets into that crisp form again. Or if you've spent a lot of time folding it and you can't bear the thought of it, then just leave it as it is and just slip the iron in around and about, and magically it just kind of crunches up and into the right shape. So it's magic stuff.
Oh, that sounds wonderful. The people also wanted to know, how do you connect the different tetrahedral shapes one to another?
Well, two options. I do both, but my preference these days is to hand stitch them, because generally speaking, I find it easier and quicker, just with a little like overcast stitch. But if you're clever and you unfold them and you've still got all those lines, if you remember which line to stitch to the next one, you can just quickly machine stitch them and then fold them all back up again, and then they're joined by machine stitch. But I end up unpicking them a lot of times because I don't like the way they are and I want to change them around, and it's much easier to undo hand stitch than machine stitch.
Well, that's for sure. And a similar or related question was, on the piece behind you with the lightning, did you paint the lightning on when it was flat or after it was already folded into the shapes?
I did it after. I could have done it before, but I think getting them to all join up would have been too much for my brain to cope with. So no, I just had it all as it is now without the lightning. And then I just painted some gum. I can't remember the name of the funny gum that you use when you use metal leaf. And then you let it go tacky. And then I just gently patted the metal leaf on and then just brushed off the excess. So yeah, I did that after.
Yep. And the last question was, where do you buy your organdy?
Well, I've seen it on eBay, so it's definitely available there. But I actually buy mine from my little local sewing shop that I always use for my sewing materials, called Midsummer Quilting.
Oh, wonderful. So wait, there's a quick question in here. What kind of thread do you use? And do you use steam? So they really want to know.
They do, don't they? Yeah. What kind of thread do I use? Any. Whatever I like. I've got polycotton, cotton. I use Aurifil, beautiful 12-weight thread. I use embroidery floss. I kind of just go with it. And steam, yes to steam, no to steam. It doesn't really seem to make much difference. If I'm getting frustrated, then I might steam it a bit extra, but nothing really much difference.
All right. Thank you. Maria, people wanted to know, can you explain a little bit more about what the house top block is? Because you showed some examples, but I think people were still not quite sure.
So it also goes by the name of quarter log cabin, and that might be the easiest way for people to understand is that if you're going to build a house top block, you're going to start with a square, and then you're going to put a strip of fabric. I think of it as being on the top and then on the left side, and then you continue to build it like that. Top, left side, top, left side. Some people, when they see my work, think that what I've done is I've created a square and a square and a square and then cut it into quarters to assemble those house top blocks, but that's not how I do it. And that has a lot to do with, I can't control the placement of prints when I build a quilt, when I build a block as a square and a square and a square and then cut into it. I have much more control when it's a house top block.
Okay. You do a lot of playing with the design. You do it small, you do it big, you do it rectangular, you combine it with other things. Some of them seem to get more chaotic and some are more controlled. How do you find a balance between the different scale of the pieces and between chaos and control?
That's a good question. A lot of times it's just a what if. So I start out with a what if. What if, people are all like, for example, I'll post something on Instagram and people are like, oh, they like all this empty space. And I was like, all right, what if I just use a really muted palette? Is that going to work? Can I do that? And that's sort of one of the places that I sort of jump off from. I often just build things to be the size of my design wall. So, and if my design wall, like when we're at our cabin, my design wall is huge, so I can build really big things. When it's at home, it's a smaller. So it's not, I'm not as controlled as people think.
Okay. And then people were really curious about the piece behind you because it is such a departure from the color palette that you've been working in for several years now. What made you decide to go super muted?
Well, I belong to an organization, a group called Cloth in Common. It's an international group of artists, and every 2 months we get a prompt. Well, the prompt, or some people call it challenge. Anyway, the word was green spaces, because under the situation now with COVID is that when we get outside, we're really appreciative of our green spaces. So, but in Alaska, our green spaces are often white. And so I thought that I would see what happens if I tried to, and it was actually much more muted, and I kept inserting more color, even though it is, in comparison to other quilts, it's a much more muted palette.
Mm-hmm. And then there was a follow-up, which they wanted to know, how are you planning on quilting it? What color threads are you thinking you'll use?
So I always use Aurifil. I put a heavier weight in my bobbin and a lighter weight on the top. And I tend to always try to match my fabric to my thread. So in the pale turquoise, I'll probably shoot for a pale turquoise thread with the yellow pieces. And that's how I tend to quilt everything. I outline each pieced bit twice and then I fill it in.
So you're going to change color with every single piece? Oh my goodness gracious.
That's how all my quilts are done. And I know it's a little, it is a little fiddly. but I love how it looks, so I'm willing to do it.
All right. That's fantastic. I didn't realize that. I'll have to look more carefully the next time I'm actually in the room with one of your works. That's amazing. Maggie, people were fascinated to hear your stories about the petroglyphs. One of the questions was, you've gone to several different sites. Do you have a bucket list of sites that you're still planning on visiting?
Sure. I want to go to Australia and Ayers Rock. That's on my bucket list. I would like to see more national parks in the US. You have amazing national parks. I would like to go back to Mesa Verde and hang out there for a week or so and just climb through it all. I've been there once, but I think it's my favorite. Those cliff dwellings are unbelievable. And I think about trying to raise a child 3,000 feet in the air with this, 1,000 square foot or 2,000 square foot dwelling that houses 10 people. And how do you keep the kids from, I don't know, it's just all trying to imagine how they lived and putting myself back in those places. So those, exploring more in the US and then abroad, Australia is really calling me.
Mm-hmm. And when you create your art, are you recreating the petroglyphs from just one site, or are you combining petroglyphs from different sites?
Well, the two big pieces that you saw are pretty site specific. Betalina is, but at that petroglyph complex, there's Serafina, there's a whole bunch of other rocks, and they depicted different kinds of stories. A lot of them were warrior stories and fighting stories. And I think once they started to have to protect their turf, that changed. So I didn't like those stories as much. So I pick and choose also, and I want to tell a story in my own quilt. And newspaper rock obviously has hundreds of images, so I pick and choose those, and they're scattered over a lot of rocks. And then sometimes I make them up. So my stamps are these critters that I think, well, close enough, they could have made one like this. I get inspired by what's there, and then I do my thing too. So a combination of all of that.
Okay. One of the questions was, what is your thought process about using imagery that was developed by a different culture's sacred theology?
I guess that's the term for that is cultural appropriation, and that's certainly a deep consideration. I guess I feel like I have a familial attachment to the First Nations world because of my ex-husband. I'm still really, really close to his family, and my kids are half Cree and Dutch Canadian. And I am embraced and loved in my Cree family and in my Cree world. And I've had long conversations with my ex and his family about this, and they're very, very supportive. So that feels like they love my work. So that feels like, even though I'm not Cree by any stretch, I am part of that world in a deeper way. And so I feel okay with it.
Okay. I think that's the best answer you can give. And Brenda Smith is recommending that you check out the Navajo National Monument in Arizona.
Okay, awesome. And I know in France, and there's, the Lascaux caves. Anyway, that's another one with the horses. Oh my goodness, I can't wait to get there. Or there's now a pretend version of that one that people can go in because the other ones are protected.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. Navajo. All right.
Yeah. Okay. Libby, what people want to know is, really tea bags? And what kind of tea? And is the tea bag made of paper or fabric? They really, some of the commentators have taken your class or read your book, so they know, yes, they really are tea bags. But for those attendees who are not familiar, please explain about the tea bags.
All right, I will. Yes, absolutely authentic little square paper tea bags. And I kind of came about this. I drink a lot of tea anyway, so that was a lucky part of it. But I drink a lot of tea that has the tag and the string, but that little substrate is tiny. And I was really frustrated with that little bitty thing. And then I came across Celestial Seasonings tea, which is not, there's not a tag and there's not a string. It's just a box of the little 2.5-inch square tea bags. So that is my tea of choice right now, only because of this. Well, I love the tea and I love the substrate. And some of them are, you can, when you steep the tea, you know, you'll know this when you're making your own tea, different tea leaves will create different stains, and some have a lot more oils in them. So the amount of steeping will create different patterns that I sometimes try and control, and sometimes I have no control over it. But I play around with all of that a lot, and they are very fragile. These little pieces of paper, you know, well, they're made to scrunch up in hot water, so they're, you know, a little bit hardy, but they are paper tissue, and I spend quite a lot of time drying them carefully and then slicing them open and tickling out all the little bitty tea leaves, shaking, and then I get a giant pile of tea leaves that I compost. And then I seal them up. Sometimes I slip little bitty pieces of muslin inside the tea bags to stabilize them. And sometimes I'll put stabilizer on the backside.
Wow.
And why tea bags instead of just cutting up small pieces of muslin to start with?
Yep, why? There's no good answer. I just love it. I was challenged by it. I was very inspired originally by some artists who were using tea bags. They were painters. So they were painting on teeny tiny little tea bags, and that was the end result, a little tea bag with an image on it. And so then my brain went, well, I'm a fiber artist. How do I do this? And I naturally went with my papers and my stitching, and I had to work with the delicacy of the paper to strengthen them. And then it's just gone from there, and it will not stop.
So Allison Schwabe wants to know, well, do your quilts smell like tea?
No, they don't. I don't think so. I don't think so. They're yeah, I do steep out most of the tea. Actually, some of the peppermint tea, I will say, yes, some of the peppermint teas, which I love, by the way, have a really good residual scent.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the questions that I had was, you said that the zippers were about combining things and pulling them apart. What do you feel the measuring tapes symbolize? Because you put them in a lot of your work too.
They're everywhere. And I use a lot of vintage measuring tapes when I can find them. And it's about growth. It's kind of a it's a pretty clear metaphor for the growth in my work. And they're in behind me in this piece. They're everywhere. So if you look closely in some of my work, you'll see both of those.
I've got one more quick how-to question for you, and then we're running out of time. What kind of fabric, paints, markers, etc. do you prefer?
I use everything and anything. I use mostly acrylic paint, and the better quality, of course, gives a lot richer layers of color, but I'll use everything, even down to craft paints. I don't care about the hand of the fabric, and I actually like to challenge myself, and I don't know why this is a really weird thing, but I like the crispy, hard surface sometimes of heavily painted fabric with acrylics. And then I'm challenged with trying to stitch through that, which is a bear. But so I'll use every kind of fabric, anything I can thread a needle through for stitching, all sorts of different threads, and most varieties of paint.
Well,
and I keep it all. I have it all.
I think we all keep it all. I mean, that seems to be part and parcel of doing fiber art, is that things accumulate. We are out of time. I want to thank all 4 artists for being here and sharing about your studios. To the attendees, hang in. We're going to show the whole exhibition one more time, so you'll have the opportunity. And you'll be getting more information by email about next week's Textile Talk. And that has the link to the recording so that you can watch it, share it with your friends. And please make sure that you go to SAQA.com/auction and see all of the wonderful art that we're going to have up for bid a week from It's been great.